Good morning, Con 102 class. Professor Sparks here, and we are going to be talking today about expectancy violations theory. The author of this theory is Judy Burgoon. I will tell you a few things about Judy Burgoon. She is one of the most prolific researchers and publishers of communication scholarship in our discipline. More recently, she has become involved in the detection of deception, and she has been involved in some major grants from the government in putting together machines that can monitor a number of nonverbal signals at the same time, including pupil dilation and physiological symptoms, such that if a person checks in at an airport and goes through one of these screeners, there is a very high probability that if the person is engaging in deceptive behavior, these machines might be able to detect that. So Professor Burgoon has been involved in a lot of very interesting research. She was featured in Wired magazine several months ago, and I will post a version of that article on the website so that you can read about Professor Burgoon's involvement in that deception detection research. So I will place that in the folder of things linked or interesting links associated with lecture. Today we are looking at her expectancy violations theory, and I want to focus today specifically in talking about the role of arousal in that theory, because along with one of my colleagues, Professor John Green, we got involved in an extensive bit of research surrounding the role of arousal in Burgoon's theory. Now, as the textbook states on page 87, Burgoon suggested in this theory that noticeable deviations from what we expect cause us to experience a heightened state of arousal. And these two pictures sort of indicate that in a more playful way. So that contraption there that is wired to the toilet would certainly lead to a noticeable deviation from what a person expected when they used the toilet. And a person who has a hand buzzer in their hand when they go to shake hands with you would certainly cause you to have a noticeable deviation from what you might expect if you shook hands with that person. And what Burgoon says in the theory is that when you notice these kinds of deviations from expectation, they cause a heightened state of arousal. Now, if I was there today physically in lecture, I might demonstrate this. And Doug, if you are there, you can certainly play this role. But sometimes at this point in the lecture, what I do is I come walking down the aisle and I stand very close to somebody sitting in an aisle seat and proceed to talk. And usually that person is experiencing a bit of a heightened sense of arousal when I do that, because this is a noticeable deviation from expectation. Up until this point in the semester, I've never done that, and I wait until this lecture to sort of walk down the aisle and stand right in front of a person's face, and they report that, that caused their arousal level to go up. And that's what Burgoon is talking about here, that when there is this noticeable deviation, arousal goes up. And with arousal, what we're talking about is an increased heart rate, increased respiration rate, maybe an increase in skin conductance and systolic blood pressure. So there are a host of arousal symptoms that change with these deviations. And what Burgoon maintains is that this arousal, this increased arousal, would cause us to review the nature of our relationship with the person who acted in a curious way. So if a person caused you this unexpected arousal, it would cause you to review your relationship and take an assessment of it and maybe reevaluate that. Now, what I'm interested in today is talking about what really amounts to a retreat from this arousal concept in Burgoon's thinking as her theory evolves. So if you read this chapter carefully, you will note that this theory changed over time. Burgoon made some modifications in the theory, and on page 88, Griffin states very clearly that Burgoon's retreat from arousal as an explanatory mechanism has been a gradual retreat. She originally stated that people felt physiologically aroused when their proxemic expectations were violated. So there's a little guideline here in the chapter in terms of the appropriate distance for interaction. And when people violate that distance, that's the study of proxemics, they feel physiologically aroused when those distances are violated. Well, later on, she kind of softened this concept to what she called an orienting response. Not physiological arousal so much as a mental alertness that focused attention on the person who was violating that appropriate proxemic distance. So not so much a heart rate response, not so much a systolic blood pressure response, but a kind of a cognitive alertness response. And she now no longer considers it a necessary link. She no longer considers arousal a necessary link between expectancy violation and communication outcome. So she no longer places this high priority on physiological arousal as a causal mechanism in reevaluating one's relationship and the communication outcomes in that relationship. What I want to focus on today is maybe some of the reasons that took place. Why did Burgoon make this kind of gradual move away from physiological arousal as a key concept? Over time, she changed her conception of arousal and her view of how important a concept it was in expectancy violations theory. Now later on, she became interested once again in the theoretical role of arousal, but she wanted to find a way around the measurement problems associated with that concept. And there are a lot of problems associated with physiological arousal that may have led Burgoon to retreat a bit from its central role in expectancy violations theory. First of all, and I can tell you that I have measured physiological arousal in my research over the years, and so I know a bit about this and can talk to each one of these points. First of all, physiological arousal is relatively expensive to incorporate into one's research laboratory and their research protocols. The equipment is not cheap, and the more sophisticated the equipment is, the more expensive it is. So a scholar has to have some grant money, typically, to support the purchase of this equipment. The electrodes cost money, and overall, while the cost of physiological equipment has dropped, maybe over the years, some of the equipment has become so sophisticated and accurate that it's also very expensive. So it's not cheap to measure physiological arousal in one's research, and generally somebody who comes to a university like Purdue and is measuring this would request a fairly hefty start-off package that would require the purchase of a fairly sophisticated set of electrodes and computers and so forth. Secondly, arousal is difficult to measure because it intrudes into the communication situation. So let's suppose you're studying nonverbal behavior, for example. Oftentimes, people have to wear the electrodes on their hand or on their arm, and that might actually intrude into the very behavior that you are studying and affect it. So it's sometimes a very delicate move that you have to make when you are measuring physiological arousal in terms of affecting the very behavior that you're looking at. So that is also an aspect of it that makes it difficult to use sometimes. Thirdly, when you're measuring physiological arousal, there are huge data sets involved. So typically, you might be measuring maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 different channels: heart rate, blood pressure, skin conductance, respiration rate, muscle tension. And for each one of those, you might be taking a data point every second and storing that in a computer. Well, you can imagine that very quickly, if you have a half-hour session or an hour session, and you've got 5 channels where you're measuring a data point every second, you have, at the end of the day, a huge data set if you're running 100 people through that experiment. So those huge data sets become quite awkward and unwieldy to handle. You need sophisticated software packages to deal with the processing of those data sets, and they're not very easy to manage. Next, there is a learning curve in terms of the analysis of physiological data. There's not any necessary agreed-upon way to analyze the physiological data that has been collected. There are lots of different algorithms and formulas and ways to put physiological data together in an analysis scheme, and there really is not any universal agreement about the conventions associated with that. And so it's sometimes difficult to convince reviewers to accept any particular way of analyzing the physiological data that you have analyzed. Finally, the concept of arousal may not even be a single unitary construct. So what I mean by that is arousal has multiple components to it, and it may not even be a coherent concept that we can talk about when we say that a person is aroused or not aroused. We're talking about a lot of different responses, and one person's arousal may not look like another person's arousal, and it may not even make sense to talk about arousal in that way as a single concept like that. So there are a host of difficulties associated with the measurement of physiological arousal, and for those reasons, Burgoon really wanted to kind of move away from the measurement of arousal. And in one of her papers, she announced that she had found a solution to the difficulty of the measurement of arousal. And the solution was very simple. The solution was, I won't measure physiological arousal. Instead, I will measure nonverbal behavior. And I will allow the nonverbal behavior, or I will argue that the nonverbal behavior is actually a good stand-in for the physiological measure. So what she argues here is nonverbal behavior is a symptom of physiological arousal, and it's much easier to measure. So perhaps if Doug did walk up to somebody earlier in the lecture and stand in front of them, perhaps that person started moving around or fidgeting a little bit or stroking their hair or moving their arm, and they engaged in some kind of nonverbal behavior. And what Burgoon is arguing is that that nonverbal behavior then becomes a symptom of physiological arousal. And so all we need to do, really, she says, is look at a person's nonverbal behavior, and we can make a judgment about how aroused they are. That was really the goal. And so we can dispense with the physiological arousal measuring equipment. All we need to do is look at their nonverbal behavior. Now, Burgoon ended up publishing an article in our flagship journal of communication, Human Communication Research, and this is the cover page of it. It was called The Nature of Arousal and Nonverbal Indices. And this is the abstract that's printed there. And she's reporting what she did in this article to use nonverbal behavior as a measure of arousal. What was the goal of this study? Well, what she said in the study, and this is a quote from the study itself, she said, what is material is whether a profile of observable nonverbal indicators can validly supplant physiological or self-report measures and transform arousal from inferred to empirical status. What does she mean by that? Well, what she's trying to do is she's simply saying what we would like to do is we'd like to look at somebody's nonverbal behavior, their nonverbal indicators, and we want to use those nonverbal indicators as a valid measure of their physiological reactions. What we'd like to be able to do is look at somebody, look at how they're moving, look at their nonverbal gestures, their nonverbal behavior, and make an inference and say, we can look at them and say, they are this aroused. Their arousal is this high as opposed to this high, or it's this low as opposed to this low. We can actually make a good guess, and not only a guess, but a valid measurement of their arousal by looking at their nonverbal behaviors. That's what she claimed to do in this study. And in the final claim of the study, the final quotation, she said that the current results of her study endorsed the value of using nonverbal behaviors as an alternative to physiological instrumentation to assess arousal states in communication and psychology research. So she concluded at the end of this study that she had done it, that she had found a way to simply look at a person's nonverbal behavior and tell how aroused they were. Now, if in fact she had accomplished that, it would have been a really big deal, because there were people like me who were trying to measure physiological arousal in the context of my research and deal with the expense and deal with the large data sets and deal with the analysis problems. And Burgoon came along and said, hey, look, you don't have to do that anymore. Just look at a person's nonverbal behavior and you can tell how aroused they are. You don't need all this equipment. just look at their nonverbals, and this is going to be a valid way to assess that. So, how did she do it? How did she actually do this research? Well, what she did is she had people talking to each other in conversations, and she videotaped those conversations. And then she had people like you, undergraduates, watch these conversations, and some of them rated the people who were carrying on the conversations in terms of how aroused they appeared to be. So she got people to watch these videos and say, give me a rating on a 1 to 10 scale of how physiologically aroused these people are. Now, I've got a little video here, rate this person's arousal level, and Doug can clip on this and play it. And what you'll see here is there is a woman in a kind of an interview situation. This is not the video that Burgoon used, but it was video like this. And so you see a person here not talking. You don't hear the sound, but you hear a person, or you see a person sitting there gesturing, moving around, engaging in various nonverbal behaviors. And so Doug can play this video and can ask several of you to rate this woman's arousal level. If I asked you, how aroused do you think this person is on a 1 to 10 scale, 1 being very low level of arousal, 10 being a high level of arousal, what number would you give her? So Doug, you can do that now, and let's get some arousal ratings for this woman who is doing a job interview. And so that's the first thing that she did. Then she had other coders look at the same videos, and instead of rating how aroused these people were, they rated the person's nonverbal behavior during those same conversations. So what she asked people to do is rate the level of gestures that the person had, rate their body movement, rate how often they stroked their hair or touched their face, rate their posture and how much they were moving around in the seat. Rate their nonverbal behavior. So she had one set of coders look at that video and rate the arousal level of the person, and then she had another set of coders rate their nonverbal behaviors. And what did she find out? Well, lo and behold, she found out that when she correlated the coder ratings of arousal with the coder ratings of nonverbal behavior, they were highly correlated. That is to say, when a person was rated as having a high level of nonverbals, they also were rated as having a high level of physiological arousal. Now, that may not seem particularly surprising, and it was not particularly surprising to me and to my colleague John Green. This is an article that we wrote in response to Burgoon's piece of research when we read this. Because when Burgoon came back with this article and we read it, we looked at it and we said, well, wait a minute. She says that we can use nonverbal behaviors to substitute or to validly supplant measures of physiological arousal. And yet, when we read this piece, we realized that the ratings of nonverbal behavior and the ratings of arousal were really based on exactly the same pieces of information. Those of you who rated the nonverbal behavior when Doug asked you to do that, and those of you who rated the arousal level, what information were you using? You were using the very same information, and so it isn't surprising that these two measures were correlated with each other. You're actually looking at the very same thing. What other information do you have to rate arousal levels than how much nonverbal movement is going on? And so it isn't particularly surprising that these things are correlated. What my colleague John Green and I realized when we read this piece is that Burgoon had left out a very important piece of information that she really needed. The evidence that she offered for her claim could not possibly establish her claim. To make a claim that the nonverbal behaviors could be used as an indicator of arousal, you would have to measure both nonverbal behavior and physiological arousal. She didn't measure physiological arousal. She simply measured nonverbal behaviors and ratings of arousal. So she didn't measure what she had to measure in order to establish this claim. And I have to tell you, when Professor Green came to my office to show me this article, I took it home and read it, And I came back the next day and I said, how did this get published? The evidence to establish this claim that she wants to make is not here. She didn't measure physiological arousal. And Professor Green said, well, that's what I thought. What are we going to do? And so our second point that we made was that she didn't measure physiological arousal. She measured nonverbal behaviors and coder perceptions of arousal. The coder records of nonverbal behavior were correlated to the coder perceptions of arousal. And why wouldn't they be? They were really, that's all the information you had in the video. John and I decided in response to this that we had to do our own study, because how could it be that these two measures would not be correlated? They were both based on the coding of the same exact behavior. And so John and I realized that we had some work to do, and we undertook our own investigation where we replicated Burgoon's conversations, and we too recorded conversations and had undergraduate coders like yourselves rate the videos for arousal and rate each person's video for nonverbal behaviors. And we were able to replicate her data when we did that. But we did something else. We also measured physiological arousal. So in order to test the claim, we realized that we had to do a study that includes physiological measures and measures of nonverbal behavior. So that's what we did. We made recordings like she did, and we also introduced measures of heart rate and skin conductance and muscle tension, and we incorporated those into our particular study. So we replicated her study using the coder ratings of nonverbal behavior and actual measures of physiological arousal. We found the same thing that she did. Those two measures were correlated. They had to be, because they were based on exactly the same nonverbal cues. We expected that they would be correlated, and they were. But we found that nonverbal behavior and the physiological measures that we used in our study were completely uncorrelated. So a person's heart rate was not higher if they were gesturing more. A person's heart rate was not lower if they were sitting there calm at the table. That's a little bit intuitive. If you go to the doctor's office sometimes, you know that you might appear to be calm, but if they take your blood pressure might be higher. It's not necessarily related to how much you're moving. It's related to what's going on in your head and to some other things. So it's not particularly surprising that we did not find that these things were correlated. So in our study, nonverbal behavior was not correlated with physiological measures, and this would tend to refute Burgoon's claim that we could use nonverbal behaviors as measures of physiological arousal. In our study, we found that those things were not necessarily related to each other at all. In fact, as we say here, they were completely uncorrelated. There was no real relationship between them, and we looked for that relationship in many different ways. This is a graph here of a correlation where you have you have the x-axis and the y-axis. So each point here represents a person, and on the x-axis, as you go from left to right, their nonverbal behavior might be getting larger, and on the y-axis, as you go from bottom to top, their physiological arousal is going up. And as you see here, this graph, if we had all of these people in the study, as you can see, there's no real relationship between the levels of nonverbal behavior on the x-axis and the levels of arousal on the y-axis. You have some people who are very low on nonverbal behaviors on the low end of the x-axis, who are also very high on arousal on the y-axis. You also have people who are very high on nonverbal behavior on the x-axis, who are low on physiological arousal on the y-axis. And so what did we conclude? Well, we concluded that taken together, these analyses suggest that the correlations between physiological arousal and observer ratings of nonverbal behaviors examined by us and by Burgoon are virtually zero. Now, as you might imagine, Burgoon was not really happy when Professor Green and I published this particular paper. We had a very different conclusion than she had, and we concluded that the opposite of what she concluded. We said that evidence for the validity of observer ratings of nonverbal behaviors as measures of physiological arousal has yet to be produced. Notice something about this conclusion. We didn't say there was no relationship. We couldn't say that because we didn't measure every possible physiological indicator. We only measured a handful, but the handful that we measured, we didn't find the relationship. So what we said was that we looked at a handful of physiological measures. We could not find the relationship with nonverbal behaviors, and so we just said the evidence has yet to be produced. And this puts the onus back on Burgoon, back on her to say, hey, produce the evidence. We couldn't produce it. Maybe you have it. Maybe you have produced it, and maybe you can. We didn't want to say it can't be produced, but we put the burden back on her to produce it. We ended up saying we should not accept claims about the validity of any nonverbal index until that validity has been demonstrated. Now, this actually turned into a bit of a research mystery story that got kind of fun for us. We didn't know whether or not Burgoon actually had evidence that physiological measures were correlated with nonverbal behaviors. We knew that she had a doctoral student who was working in this area, and we had a doctoral student as well who happened to be living out in Arizona where Burgoon was doing this work. And when spring break came, we went to our graduate student and said, hey, could you go to the library there in the communication department and look up this person's dissertation and see what's in it and make a copy of it to see whether or not she actually does have some evidence, because we wanted to anticipate whether or not she was going to come back with evidence of a relationship between arousal and nonverbal behavior. And so our graduate student was able to do that successfully over spring break, and we found out that actually she had collected some data on this, but there was no relationship in her data either. So we felt particularly confident that we were not going to face a claim later on that she had evidence that physiological arousal was correlated with nonverbal behavior. So what happened was we really believed that Burgoon was planning to claim that she was able to measure physiological arousal in all of her studies by simply looking at nonverbal behavior. And our results surely derailed that plan. She was no longer really in a position to make claims about physiological arousal, and she has not done so. She did not find out about our paper until it appeared on a convention program that was being presented at the International Communication Association. And I was the one who presented our paper. And at the end of the paper, her hand went up in the audience, and she stood up and she said, well, we never claimed that you could validly supplant physiological measures with nonverbal behavior. And I said, oh, okay, well, that's not the way we read your claim. And so I simply read from her paper. I picked up her paper and I read her claim that we can validly supplant physiological measures with nonverbal behavior. And she kind of looked at me and she just sat down. She didn't say anything after that. So this was kind of fun. Now, in the aftermath of this, you might wonder what happened. Well, they published a response to our paper, and this was the title of her article, A Reply from the Heart. Who are Sparks and Green, and why are they saying all these horrible things? You would have thought that we had engaged in character assassination by pointing out that Burgoon did not have evidence to make this claim. And we were stunned by the title of this article when we saw it. We thought about asking the editor not to permit this title to run, but then upon second thought we said, well, no, this is such a bad title, and it makes things so personal, where our article was not personal at all. We simply stuck to the main point. We said, no, let them publish that. We'll come up with a rejoinder in a response that we will make. And so we came up with this alternative in replying to her intellectual scrutiny as an alternative to replies from the heart, toward clarifying the nature of arousal and its relation to nonverbal behavior. And of course, our clarification was that physiological arousal and nonverbal behavior are not particularly correlated when you get people talking in conversation like this. So it was a series of papers that were published in the Human Communication Research Journal, and a lot of graduate students over the years have read this exchange, and we think that we were fairly successful in derailing this idea that nonverbal behavior could be used as a substitute for physiological responses in communication research. Now, as a general footnote here at the end of this, I would say that, again, physiological arousal is a very difficult concept to integrate into communication research, but there are a number of people who are doing it. I have measured it routinely because I measure emotional reactions to frightening movies and violent movies and so forth, and so I frequently attach electrodes to people as they're in the laboratory watching films. And there are other physiological measures that people have routinely used in communication research as well. We now have some people who are measuring functional magnetic resonance imaging. They're looking at the brain and what the brain does. And I think there's an important point here when we talk about the measurement of physiological arousal. And that point is this. There are many different measures of physiological arousal, and it could be that there is still some combination of physiological indices that are related to nonverbal behavior. John Green and I never really dismissed that concept. We have always allowed for the possibility that there could be some particular combination of physiological indicators that are related to a person's nonverbals. We may simply not have found those yet. So that's a possibility. It just has not been forthcoming, and certainly Burgoon has not demonstrated that. So I focus today on the arousal part of this theory. The theory itself is more than just about arousal, but I think that this is an interesting theoretical example of a case where a key concept in the theory sort of evolves and changes, and there was certainly some pressure from Burgoon to want to measure this in a different way, and it just turned out to be a misguided effort. Arousal is a very interesting concept in communication. It plays into a lot of different scenarios. If you had COM 114, you know that when you get up in front of people to give a speech, arousal is certainly an issue. Heart rate goes up, the skin sweats. So the arousal response is a response that takes place very frequently in the communication context and is a very important response to sort of take account of, and it's one worth studying. We have arousal that occurs in a lot of different forums in the communication environment, and it does play a role in human communication, certainly. But it's probably not the case, right now at least, that we have any good evidence that you can use a person's nonverbal behavior as a substitute for physiological arousal. Thanks for listening. Hey, I'm still recovering, and I do hope to make it back at some point, just not back quite yet. So I do look forward to greeting you in person at some point in the future. Thanks a lot, and I hope you continue to enjoy the course.